In the summer of 1914, a weathered ship named Endurance sat in the London docks, her wooden hull creaking against the ropes that held her to shore. On her deck stood a barrel-chested man with piercing blue eyes and a jaw that seemed carved from granite. Ernest Shackleton, explorer, dreamer, and captain of one of the most ambitious journeys ever attempted. "We're not just crossing Antarctica," Shackleton told his assembled crew, his voice booming across the deck. "We're going to walk where no human being has ever set foot. From one side of the frozen continent to the other. 2,000 miles across the bottom of the world." 27 men stood before him. Sailors, scientists, a ship's carpenter, a photographer, and even a stowaway who had begged to join the crew. Among them was Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, a New Zealander with an uncanny gift for navigation, and Tom Crean, a tough Irish sailor who had already survived 2 brutal polar expeditions. "The pay is low," Shackleton had written in his now famous advertisement. "The hours are long, the dangers many. Safe return doubtful." And yet every man aboard had chosen this life anyway. There was something about the ice, something that called to the boldest hearts of their generation. As Endurance pulled away from the dock, the world around her was changing. War had just broken out in Europe. Some said the expedition should be cancelled. Shackleton offered his ship and crew to the Royal Navy instead, but was told to continue the voyage. "Proceed," came the telegram. And so they did, sailing south into the unknown, unaware that history was already being written. Not the history of triumph they imagined, but something far greater, a story of survival. By January 1915, Endurance had reached the edge of the Weddell Sea, one of the most treacherous stretches of ocean on Earth. Massive plates of ice, some larger than city blocks, drifted and collided around the ship like a slow-motion battlefield. "Steady as she goes," Worsley called from the helm, his eyes scanning the endless white maze ahead. The temperature had dropped to well below freezing. Icicles hung from the rigging like crystal daggers. The crew worked in shifts, chopping at ice that threatened to crush the hull. But the frozen sea had other plans. On January 19th, the unthinkable happened. The ice closed in around Endurance like a fist, locking her in place. The ship groaned under the pressure, her timbers straining against forces no vessel was built to withstand. "She's stuck fast, sir," reported the first mate, his breath forming clouds in the Antarctic air. Shackleton climbed onto the deck and looked out at the frozen world surrounding them in every direction. There was no ocean visible anymore, only ice, stretching to the horizon like a white desert. "Then we wait," Shackleton said calmly, though inside, his mind was racing. He knew what this meant. They were not just delayed. They were trapped. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The men settled into a strange rhythm of life aboard the frozen ship, playing games, telling stories, caring for the sled dogs, and watching the ice slowly tighten its grip. Then, in October 1915, after 10 months trapped, the ice began to crush Endurance for real. The sound was like cannon fire, deep, thunderous cracks as the pressure built beyond what the wooden hull could bear. "She's going down," Shackleton said quietly, watching from a safe distance as his ship, his home, his hope of completing the crossing, began to break apart. Timbers snapped like matchsticks. Water poured into the hold. The crew worked frantically to salvage what supplies they could: food, tents, sleeping bags, and 3 small lifeboats, before Endurance finally sank beneath the ice on November 21st, 1915. Shackleton gathered his men on the ice floe that would become their temporary home. 28 men, no ship, and nearly 1,200 miles from the nearest outpost of civilization. "Ship and stores have gone," Shackleton wrote in his journal that night. "So I suppose we really have got to occupy ourselves getting the men home." But to his crew, he said something different. Standing before them on the ice, with the wreckage of their ship barely visible beneath the frozen surface, he spoke words that would define the next 2 years of their lives. "Men," he said, "the ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." It wasn't a lie. It was leadership. And every man there believed him. What followed was a test of human endurance unlike anything the crew had imagined. They set up camp directly on the drifting ice floe, naming it Ocean Camp. Below their feet, the Weddell Sea churned, and above them, blizzards howled without mercy. Shackleton understood something critical. Survival wasn't just about food and shelter. It was about morale. A man who lost hope would die faster than a man who lost his rations. He organized the days carefully. Every man had a job. The dogs were fed and cared for, even as food supplies dwindled. In the evenings, they sang songs, held mock debates, and celebrated birthdays with whatever meager treats could be spared. "Keep them busy," Shackleton told his officers. "An idle mind on the ice is a dangerous thing." Frank Wild, Shackleton's most trusted second-in-command, worked tirelessly to keep spirits high, cracking jokes even in the worst weather. Meanwhile, the ship's photographer, Frank Hurley, risked his life multiple times to dive into the freezing wreckage of Endurance to recover his precious photographic plates, images that would later tell the world this extraordinary story. But as months passed, the ice floe beneath them began to shrink and crack. The camp had to be moved multiple times. Food supplies ran low, and eventually, the unthinkable decision was made. The sled dogs, beloved companions who had pulled equipment and lifted spirits for over a year, had to be put down. It was one of the hardest days of the entire expedition, and grown men wept openly on the ice. By April 1916, the ice floe had drifted for hundreds of miles and had shrunk to a dangerously small size. It was time for a desperate gamble. "We take to the boats," Shackleton announced. 3 small lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, were launched into the freezing, storm-tossed waters of the Southern Ocean. For 5 days, the men rowed and sailed through nightmarish conditions, drenched in freezing spray, fighting off exhaustion, frostbite, and the constant threat of massive waves capsizing their fragile crafts. "Row! Keep rowing!" Worsley shouted over the roar of the wind, steering the James Caird through swells that towered like moving mountains. Finally, on April 15, 1916, after nearly 500 days without solid ground beneath their feet, the exhausted crew reached Elephant Island, a barren, wind-battered rock with no vegetation, no shelter, and no hope of rescue from passing ships. The men collapsed on the beach, some kissing the frozen ground, others simply weeping with relief at finally standing on solid earth again. But Elephant Island was no salvation. It was simply a slightly less deadly form of isolation. No ships passed this way. No one in the world knew where they were. If they stayed, they would eventually starve. Shackleton knew what had to be done next, and it would require the most dangerous decision of the entire expedition. "I'm taking the James Caird to South Georgia," Shackleton announced to his officers. The plan was almost unthinkable. An 800-mile journey across the most violent seas on the planet, in a 22-foot lifeboat, navigating only by the stars and Worsley's extraordinary skill with a sextant. If they missed their target, a small island in the vast Southern Ocean, there would be no second chance. The next landmass was thousands of miles away. Shackleton selected 5 men to join him: Worsley for navigation, Tom Crean, and 3 others. The remaining 22 men would stay behind on Elephant Island under the command of Frank Wild, waiting, hoping, for rescue. "You'll come back for us," said one of the men staying behind, more statement than question. "I will," Shackleton replied. And every man there believed him, because in 2 years of impossible hardship, Shackleton had never once broken his word. On April 24, 1916, the James Caird set sail into some of the most hostile waters on Earth. The next 17 days were a living nightmare. Waves rose taller than houses. Freezing spray coated every surface in ice, threatening to sink the tiny boat under its own weight. The men took turns bailing water, steering, and trying to catch a few minutes of sleep in soaked sleeping bags. At one point, a rogue wave, what Shackleton later described as the largest wave he had witnessed in 26 years of sailing, nearly swallowed the boat whole. "For God's sake, hold on!" Shackleton yelled, gripping the tiller as the wave crashed over them. Somehow, through skill, luck, and sheer force of will, they survived. On May 10, 1916, after 17 days at sea, the exhausted crew spotted the jagged, snow-covered peaks of South Georgia rising from the ocean. But their trial wasn't over. They had landed on the wrong side of the island. Between them and the whaling station that could offer rescue stood an unmapped, seemingly impassable mountain range. With no proper climbing equipment, wearing worn-out boots and using a carpenter's adze as an ice axe, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean set off on a 36-hour trek across South Georgia's frozen mountains. Terrain that experienced mountaineers would not attempt to cross even decades later without modern gear. They climbed through the night, exhausted beyond measure, occasionally sliding down ice slopes on makeshift ropes because it was faster than climbing down safely. At one point, utterly spent, Shackleton allowed the men just 5 minutes of sleep, but woke them after only a minute, sensing that in the brutal cold, sleep could easily become death. Finally, at dawn, they heard something none of them had heard in nearly 2 years. The sound of a steam whistle from the whaling station at Stromness, calling workers to their morning shift. Tears froze on their weathered faces as they stumbled down the final slopes toward the settlement. When they finally arrived, filthy, bearded, frostbitten, and barely recognizable as human beings, the station manager who greeted them didn't know who they were. "Who are you?" he asked, staring at the 3 ragged figures before him. "My name is Shackleton," came the reply. The manager, who had known Shackleton years earlier, was stunned into silence. Everyone had assumed the expedition was lost. Shackleton's first words upon reaching safety were not about his own ordeal. "Tell me," he asked immediately, "when was the war over?" He was stunned to learn that World War I was still raging, over 2 years after they had left civilization. But his second concern was immediate and unwavering: his men. 22 crew members were still stranded on Elephant Island, and 3 more remained on the far side of South Georgia. Rescue efforts began at once. It took 4 attempts, battling pack ice and brutal weather, before a ship finally succeeded in reaching Elephant Island on August 30, 1916. As the rescue ship approached, Shackleton anxiously counted the figures on the beach, desperate to know if all his men had survived. They had. Every single one. When Frank Wild saw the ship approaching, he shouted to the exhausted, half-starved men who had endured over 4 months on that desolate rock, "Boss is here." The joy, the tears, the disbelief. After enduring over 2 years trapped in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, every member of the Endurance expedition was going home alive. Not a single life was lost. In an age when polar expeditions frequently ended in tragedy, Shackleton had guided all 28 men through unimaginable hardship and brought every one of them home safely. The expedition never achieved its original goal. Shackleton never completed his crossing of Antarctica. In the traditional sense, the mission had failed. And yet it became one of history's greatest triumphs, remembered not for what was accomplished, but for what was overcome. Shackleton's leadership held the answer. He never lost hope, even when the situation seemed impossible. He shared danger equally with his men, took personal responsibility for every hard decision, and always put his crew's survival above his own ambitions. When the goal became impossible, he redefined success itself, not reaching Antarctica, but bringing every man home alive. Decades later, historians and leadership experts still study Shackleton's decisions during those 2 brutal years. His story teaches a timeless lesson. True leadership is not measured by the absence of failure, but by the refusal to abandon those who depend on you when everything falls apart. Great leadership can defeat impossible challenges, not by avoiding hardship, but by facing it together, one frozen day at a time, until the ice finally lets go.